usually do the webinars, which is, half hour, bang, bang, bye, bye. What we're going to do is I'm going to introduce two teams of students who have done research, participatory and community-based research as a member of a team. So as members of teams, so we have two teams that worked this past summer. The first one is a team who went to, as part of the Resilient Urban Latin America International Research Experience for Students, or RULA IRES, went to Guayaquil, Ecuador this summer. And we're going to hear from them first. And there were 5 students in that program. I believe they're all on the call. But you'll hear from Isabella Pacenza and Carlos Romero. And then the second team worked in Arizona on the Salt and Gila River, understanding the Salt and Gila River from a restoration context. And I'm not sure if everybody's on that, but there were 6 students involved in that. We're going to hear from Jorge Morales Guerrero, Catherine Weiss, and Mandy Kuhn. So I think that and then to let you know, they're going to each give us about 15-20-minute talks and time for short questions. And then we're going to spend the last 15-20 minutes on a panel discussion with involving all of the students who participated in these 2 team science experiences this summer. I should mention the second one is called the Interdisciplinary Identity-Based Intensive Team Science Experience, or ITSE. So, okay, so enough from me. I'm really excited to hear about the work that was done this summer. And the first one is going to be presented by Izzy and Carlos. It's called Community Perspectives on Flooding and Other Environmental Risks in Cinco de Junio, Duran, Ecuador. So whichever one of you is sharing slides, then go ahead.
Okay, hi everybody, I'm Izzy. I'll share my screen. Actually, wait, Carlos, can you share your screen? Mine's been weird.
Yeah, let me pull that up real quick. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, my name is Izzy and I'm here with Carlos Romero. And we're going to be talking about our research that we did over the summer. As Nancy said, it's called Community Perspectives on Flooding and Other Environmental Risks in Cinco de Junio, Duran, Ecuador.
Wait, sorry. Here we go. It was on a PDF, and now we have the slides.
Okay. And I think it's loading, but I think it's, yes, perfect.
All right, so everyone can see it, right?
Yes.
All right. So Nancy already talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the presentation, but my name is Carlos, and Izzy and my colleagues and I were part of this year's International Research Experience for Students. And this was under the umbrella of the Resilient Urban Latin America project. And this summer we were working in Guayaquil, Ecuador. And before going in this summer, we were kind of talking about like potential research topics, and we wanted to do something related to finding nature-based solutions to flooding problems in the region. But this meant that even beforehand, we had to take some important considerations before going into the region. The first of which was the importance of Spanish for both communication and research there. And so we had to keep that take that into consideration before planning a specific project. And not only that, but also the fact that we were going to be having like safety, we had to be safe in a foreign country. And so these were things that we had to keep in mind while working together to find a research topic. But not only that, something else was the fact that this was interdisciplinary research. The 5 of us actually came from different universities where we studied different disciplines. And so therefore we could all bring different skills to the project this summer. And so we really had to work together even before heading into Ecuador to really just come up with a question that would cater to all of our desires and also all of our skills. Not only that, but also we had to keep in mind that whatever like research project we wanted to propose to the faculty before arrival would also have to be very flexible. This is because no matter how much knowledge we have from the professors that we were working with in the region, there is still limited knowledge until you're like actually on the ground. And not only that, but the one thing that we knew we wanted to do this summer was to do community-based research. And the thing with community-based research is that it is a shifting process. For example, it's very dependent on people's willingness to participate and also the approximation that you have to the community. And so a lot of these things we were taking into consideration before arrival into Ecuador. And then ultimately, we decided to focus on the location that, as Nancy mentioned in our title, it was Cinco de Junio in Duran, which is like a dormitory city of Guayaquil across the river. And more specifically, Cinco de Junio in Duran is an informal settlement, and they are very underserved in the sense that they lacked basic needs such as potable water, as well as wastewater management, and also even in some cases, electricity. And we wanted to work in Cinco de Junio because we wanted our work to be impactful. And we were talking with professors, and it appeared that the city of Guayaquil, which is where we were living at the time, had like a larger population, but also it had more adaptation measures already incorporated, whereas Cinco de Junio was really lacking and also faced extreme flooding problems due to the geography of the region, which used to be like a mangrove swamp. Not only that, but also, as I mentioned earlier, with community-based research, it's really important for us to have approximation with the community. And ESPOL, which is the university in Guayaquil that we were working with this summer, they had already been working within Cinco de Junio along with the municipality of Duran for up to 5 years. And they were doing research on things like flood vulnerability, which you can see on this image on the right. They did some mapping of like flood hazard sectors, and Cinco de Junio is highlighted in the black. So since we had those pre-existing connections to work with, we really wanted to focus in on this community. But also we thought it was really important to work in this community at this specific time because they were in the formalization process. But how formalization works in Duran is that you have to mitigate existing vulnerabilities before a neighborhood can be incorporated into the city. And as you can see by this map, there were very high levels of vulnerability. And so we thought it was important that our work help reduce these vulnerabilities to help them along with their formalization process. But also, since they were in these early stages of development, it was a key for like a key time to incorporate sustainable development within the neighborhood, because they were lacking a lot of these like basic infrastructures. And so we thought this was a good time to incorporate sustainable versions of those. And so all of these things put together, like I mentioned, we really wanted to do community-based research. And so given all of these different factors, we thought that this would be the perfect location to work in this summer.
Okay, so as Carlos said, it was a bit difficult for us to really have a developed idea of exactly what we were going to do until we actually reached Duran. So once we got there, we kind of started to develop our ideas more. We were working with Marta, who was there for the first couple of days of our time in Ecuador. And so we were slowly kind of deciding on what specific methodologies we wanted to incorporate everything that we really wanted to get out of this, or like exactly how we wanted to conduct this research. So we knew that we wanted to give residents basically a voice to express their own concerns and kind of grievances in their neighborhood and in their area in a free form without really imposing our own biases or opinions or like outside knowledge. So we really wanted to focus on a methodology that was centered around interviews, specifically like open-ended interviews. And also, since we were focusing on flooding in the region, we knew that there was a really important spatial component to our research. So we decided our first methodology was going to be transect walks. These basically consisted of over 4 days, so 2 weekends over 2 weeks. We reached out to residents and tried to gauge how many people would like to participate. And then on the day of, we showed up to different blocks within Cinco de Junio based on ESPL's previous flood research and where we thought would be places of interest. And residents were basically able to talk to us in an open-ended interview about whatever they really wanted to talk to us about. Specifically, we were focusing on trying to discuss flooding. Since we were there in the dry season, it was difficult for us to fully understand the scope of the flooding in the region, but a lot of them were able to express the way they experienced flooding, and then other things like trash or like crime in the area. So residents were able to talk to us about these, and this was mixed with a walk where residents were able to take us to the specific places where they thought these things, or where they knew these things were occurring. We noticed that over the 4 days that we conducted our transects, we really changed them quite a bit. It went from, in the beginning, we had set transect routes that we wanted to walk, and then we kind of realized that it was more important to let the residents take us wherever they wanted to go. So we started to have kind of a general area where we wanted to focus our walks, but residents were really able to take us kind of wherever. And also our interviews were composed of kind of guiding questions to try to stay on topic of, thank you, of, to try to stay on topic of the specific risks, like urban risks, like flooding and others that we wanted to focus on. But these guiding questions weren't very exact, and it was okay if we strayed away from them, as long as residents were kind of expressing whatever they wanted to say. So then we had a second methodology. We kind of wanted to recognize our positionality as outsiders, as Americans. Many of us were white, coming into this new place that we didn't really fully understand how things are working. We wanted to understand resident perspectives, but it was really hard for us to fully gain scope of that without the context that comes with living in the area. So for our second methodology, we decided to host an exposition. This was basically, we went to a synthetic soccer field in one of the blocks that we conducted our transect walks in Cinco de Junio, and we made a bunch of really large posters. As you can see, these ones on this photo are expressing our results that we gained from the transect walks. So some of them showed our results like those ones, and then other ones kind of showed kind of where a mobilization of what we thought, how we could move forward based on those results. So for examples, we had examples of diagrams showing possible nature-based solutions and mitigation tactics that residents could incorporate into their lives to kind of mitigate the grievances that they had expressed to us. We kind of wanted to make it we didn't want to focus on making it educational because we didn't know if it was our place to educate people who probably understood their own situation better than we could. But we wanted to kind of supplement their knowledge with our own from coming from universities in the United States. So we had the educational posters, and then we also had demonstrations showing how natural processes work. For example, how groundwater can be absorbed into a natural area rather than running off from an impermeable surface. And then we also had activities for children so that everybody would be able to come. They were focused on like nature-y activities, but it was very free form, and basically people were able to interact with the posters however we wanted. And we wanted to bring in key stakeholders to the area, so we brought the municipality and people of the area, as well as residents who were already incorporating some of the strategies we were talking about so that they could discuss how it's worked for them and how they were able to incorporate them.
All right, so as Izzy was talking about earlier, one of our methodologies was those transect walks where we were interviewing the residents. But all of those interviews were actually also recorded. And then once we recorded all of those interviews and finished, I think we did about 30 or 40 of them. We transcribed all of them. And then as a group, we sorted through all of them and translated them. And we were able to kind of dissect some main challenges that were expressed by the residents in all of these interviews. And so when we were looking for a way of displaying them, we realized that many of these problems, whether they were environmental or social or even infrastructural, they were all interconnected. And so as such, we were talking with Elizabeth, one of the professors that was there with us, and we chose to display them using this framework called SETS. And this SETS framework really helped us characterize the challenges of this informal settlement as either social, ecological, or technological systems that are not only separate, but also very interconnected. And so looking closer at this diagram on the right-hand side, you can see here Yeah, you can see here that the main challenges, for example, in the ecology sector were like vegetation without maintenance was a big one, but also lack of trees and green spaces in general, and also mud and dust, which alternated between mud in the rainy season and dust in the dry season, which caused a lot of like respiratory problems. Um, Under the technology and infrastructure wing of this chart, a main one was lack of sidewalks and curbs, but also lack of wastewater and rainwater drainage. And so this would cause problems when flooding would occur because you had fecal matter like flowing around in the neighborhood as well. And a big one was lack of illumination as well, since many of these places in the neighborhood were very dark. Under society and economy, we had things like lack of sense of community, which residents felt that led into another society and economy problem, which was delinquency and crime. But also something important about this chart is to notice where the overlaps happen. And particularly in the middle, we found that lack of green and community spaces that were inclusive was a big problem across all of these sectors. Particularly, many felt that these spaces weren't inclusive for people of all ages. Like, for example, oftentimes these like green spaces not only had no vegetation, but were just like a soccer field. And residents felt that that led to only certain like demographics having the ability to use those. But pretty much the main problem that we ran into was flooding of homes and streets. We heard from a lot of residents that flooding on streets would go up to the knee during the rainy season, and even inside of their homes, they would get flooding up until the ankle. And so this would cause damage on infrastructure and also even like furniture inside the homes. And so this really just meant a lot of loss for the communities that already didn't have much to begin with. And so we really wanted to keep all of these in consideration before making recommendations that we presented both to the municipality and the university, but also to the community itself during the exposition that Izzy mentioned.
Okay, so in terms of our recommendations, after looking at our results and kind of organizing them in the SETS framework, we wanted to really kind of think about ways that we could move forward with this rather than just kind of going in and getting these results from these residents and then leaving. We really wanted to think about what could possible next steps be, since this is a sector in development. In the early stages of development, this is really the time when these changes can be made so that residents, the needs that they had expressed to us are being met. So we kind of organized future recommendations based on what residents said they wanted more of, and based on our own kind of knowledge surrounding the issues that they were talking about. So we also organized them in the same SETS framework. So you can see here certain things like intersections between ecology and society. Residents really wanted to see more things such as community gardens where they have the ability to grow their own food. Also, between ecology and technology, residents wanted to see more parks with good lighting and playgrounds. This kind of plays into what Carlos was saying of having inclusive green spaces and just spaces that are inclusive for people of all ages and all genders. And then in the middle of all three, something that's an intersection between ecology, society, and technology, were things like natural disaster drills and action plans, because a lot of the times residents felt that they weren't prepared for natural disasters such as flooding, and they wanted kind of more of an opportunity to be able to exchange information and resources amongst each other as well as amongst the municipality. And then as we were creating our final deliverable based on all of our what we learned through this experience, we really organized these future recommendations in this framework that we kind of called scalable action. So this is kind of where we split up what residents could do in their house with the rest of their block, and also in Cinco de Junio, the sector in general. So household actions were things like growing food in your own house or collecting rainwater from the roof. Block actions could be things like community gardens, and then sector actions would be larger scale nature-based solutions, so things like bioswales that a resident can't just build themselves, that would need a whole bunch of stakeholders coming together. And then in terms of continuing the conversation, we just realized that residents really can and want to and should be more involved in planning the development of Cinco de Junio. Their voices should really be considered moving forward so that their grievances or their needs are met.
All right. And in terms of reflections, I speak for all of us when I say that we had such a really extremely positive experience this summer, both working together as a team, but also with the university, the aides from the university that helped us in our research, and also just the community members in general. And I think that we learned a lot at the end of the summer about like kind of like the based off of our research question, but also, for example, the fact that there are a lot of existing resiliency measures already happening in a lot of these Latin American informal settlements. For example, while we were at the expo, we heard from a lot of residents that rainwater capture was something that they were already doing. And also, as we were walking around with residents in their blocks, we also found mini drainage systems that residents would dig themselves in front of their homes to channel the water away during the flooding season. And so we realized that a lot of these things that we were recommending already exist. They just don't have the terminology of nature-based solutions. And so we learned that it's just a matter of terminology, but that doesn't mean that these resiliency measures aren't already happening. Not only that, but something that we ran into a lot was the issue of prioritization. As I mentioned earlier, this community lacked basic needs like potable water and sewage systems, sometimes even electricity. And so we found that it was often difficult to talk about things like the importance of creating bioswales when these basic needs weren't being met. And so it's just something to consider when talking about nature-based solutions. And then something else that really surprised us is that the Cinco de Junio community was very organized. They had block leaders, and they had a leader of leaders that we were working with. And also a lot of the community members that we interviewed have been historically involved in uniting their block and creating initiatives like picking up trash, even though they end up being ineffective in the long term. This really showed us that this involvement is already there. They just lack direct linkage to policymakers and other important stakeholders. And therefore, the last thing that we really learned was the power of universities. We were there with the university and we were working with the university. And we realized that universities have a lot of leverage with their reputation and their resources. For example, we were able to bring in many different stakeholders just by having our presence in this community. And we were able to foster conversations that we hope will continue even after we're gone. And so we just noticed a lot of these things. And like I said, I think we had an incredibly positive experience, and I'm excited to hear any questions.
Thank you very much, Carlos and Izzy. That was excellent. I think that we will go on with the next presentation and then have questions for both teams at the end, if that's okay. Thank you for the presentation. And I don't know who's starting for the ITSE team, but go ahead and share your screen. I think I read the title before.
I could share my screen, Kate. I think Jorge said that his computer is frozen. Oops. Yeah, hi, I'm Mandy Kuhn. I'm a PhD student at ASU, and I'm here with Kate Weiss and Jorge, who are also PhD candidates at ASU. And we're talking about the work that we did this summer as part of this immersive, interdisciplinary, and identity-based team science experience. So we're focusing on understanding the Salton Gila River from a restoration context. And I think the broader framing of our interest in this work is the politics of green transformation. So thinking about these huge landscape scale, visioning projects, what is to be transformed and how do we go about transforming that, or how does the governance of the project go about navigating that? And so then the place-based context that we're specifically working in is here in Arizona in the Salt and Gila River corridor, where the Gila River flows from New Mexico down to Yuma. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's 650 miles or something. And then the Salt River is the largest tributary of the Gila. And this river system is the water source for Arizona, and has been has been altered a lot historically as part of the colonial project here in Arizona, which I think Jorge will talk about a little bit more in the future. But right now there's this ongoing initiative called the Rio Reimagine project, which is a collaborative landscape planning project that across like 58 miles, and it's mostly in the urban area, like in the Phoenix metro area. And it's a visioning project for the Salt Gila River corridor. And so far, a statement of intent has been signed by 6 cities, 2 tribal governments, and their state and federal funds and support as well. And then ASU is kind of meant to be the convener between all of these partners. So us as ASU grad students, we were interested in sort of thinking about how we could leverage some of that like intel with the or some of those relationships that we have with the folks at ASU to think about the framing of this project going forward, because it's kind of like in the infancy of the project planning stages. And so then there's 6 of us in this grad group, and we decided to break into subgroups where we would have 3 lenses. So one, we have one project that's focused like on the past and understanding, reflecting on the past of the Salt Gila River corridor, and then understanding how that is engendering the present and what kinds of data or tools, like action tools, we have in the present. And then the third project was looking at how co-production of the future and how the past and present inform that. So first we will hear from our past team.
All right, thank you, Mandy. Yeah, so we are the past team, Edari and I. We are both, she's from Puerto Rico, I'm from Mexico. So we are both, or we identify as Latinos. We're also aware of our history of mestizaje and how that has some, or has granted some unearned privileges. And so it was great to work with her in terms of like having kind of like the same background. And we were really interested in learning about the history of place, because we've been here, as many of us, through the university, but sometimes we don't need to understand the past to be living here and be here, right? So we were like really interested in that. And so next slide, please. So what we did was trying to understand these different narratives in this place. And we think that if we do not remember our past, we are condemned to repeat it. And so if you go to the website in Phoenix, for the city of Phoenix, for example, you will see that, it's a city that emerged from the ashes of like past civilizations that some have vanished. And then they talk about the white settlers that arrived, and then that's the history of the city. And so we also became aware of all of this through engaging with La Briola, which is a indigenous-led library here at ASU. And so we wanted, the objective of this project was to unsettle those dominant narratives that at the end erase the indigenous past of the land, justify settler colonialism, and at the end materializes in a dispossession of land and water resources for indigenous nations here. So next, please. So what we did was basically a lead review. We went to JSTOR and NEBSCO. We ran some Boolean searches that included the indigenous nations in the area. That includes Odam, Apache, all the groups that we knew that were part of this of the Rio Reimagine, that includes the Gila and the Salt Rivers. And we also we were interested in understanding the process of engagement across history. And so our time span was from the 1500s to today. And then we also were interested in understanding the land values that were present in this land. And so we used some metrics here about like engagement in terms of, you might heard about the ladder of engagement from Arnstein. And so we were inspired by that to understand like different forms of engagement. And we found like friendship, for example, was one of the forms of engagement that Indigenous peoples have offered here, for example. So next, please. So in order to give you like just a sense of our results, we started from like what's the history of this land, and we found, or we knew, or were informed, I guess, that the Hohokam or Huhugam were the ancestors of the indigenous tribes that now currently live here in the area. So we have the Akimet Odam, who are the people that live in the river. We have the Hiashet Odam, that are people that live in the dunes. And then the Tohono Odam, that are the desert people. So the Hohokam had built this great canal system that today we use. And Arizona, for example, the name of it, it's an Odam word that means a place with where there's a lot of little rivers. And so that's referring to all the canal systems that we have. So at some point, something happened. The Hohokam left. And that is one of the backbones of the dominant narratives to say, oh, nothing happened here, you know? So next, please. But we have evidence that routes from colonizers since the like 1500s, for example, where they informed us about people living here in the area. And we also know that by the 1800s, the Odam communities, Akimet Odam communities in the area were actually experimenting economic prosperity from all these different routes that you see in the slide, in the right side, that shows the geopolitical power that they had, and they were actually expanding the canal system, and they were like facing all of this material prosperity. Next. And so at some point, settlers arrived and they stopped the flow of the river. And that caused several years of hunger for communities here. So the growth of the city is not for free, was not from free. It was at expenses of the deprivation of resources like that. So next one. And so what we found really surprised me was that all of these communities were offering friendship and were welcoming, and then the white settlers were like, okay, we're gonna get rid of all of your resources and you're gonna face all of these years of hunger. So that to me was crazy, and that didn't happen in the 1400s, like the colonization piece. Part of like how I understood colonization was like, oh, it's something that happened in the 1400s. It was not. It's something recent. And so there are some, today, there are some efforts to, counteract all of this bad past. But the cool thing was that, one of the things that we learned through this project, we went to the Mar 5 managed aquifer recharge site in the Gila River Reservation, and they restarted the canal system. They are growing their plants to produce the handcrafts that are traditional here. And so good things are happening, but this is something recent. So just to conclude, next please. So yeah, we're still writing results from our lead review, but we hope that our work acknowledges the indigenous histories of the place. We hope to contribute to break the narrative that keep erasing the indigenous past of this land. We want to inform settlers like us that are living here about the history of the land. And we, at the end, we want to facilitate dialogue between nations and the settler community and also inform projects like Rio Reimagined with a deep reflection of the past to imagine better futures.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jorge. Yeah, so we've thought a bit about the past context and how that kind of situates the cultural, social, political environment in which we're working. But in particular, if we're interested in restoration, we also need to understand what we're working with ecologically in the present. And so that's what myself, Kate Weiss, an environmental life sciences PhD candidate at ASU, and Ashley Foster, an environmental life sciences PhD student, focused on this summer. And I specifically am an urban wildlife ecologist. So I focused a lot on the wildlife, and Ashley is a hydrologist and studies water quality. And so that's what she focused on. So in terms of wildlife, we were interested in, what are the potential impacts of the river's environment on coyotes and their prey? And that's because coyotes are a significant source of human-wildlife conflict and potential human-wildlife coexistence in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And then in terms of water quality, how does water quality vary across the Salt River in the Middle Gila watershed? So in terms of wildlife, so I've been working over the past couple of years with Dr. Jesse Lewis's Salt River Wildlife Project. And so what we did was, on this gradient of urbanization, is we put 43 remote wildlife cameras and also collected like 450 coyote scats or coyote poops to see the diet content of the coyotes. So this way we can look at both what is found in these areas from the cameras, as well as what the coyotes specifically are eating. And so you can see here on this map, right, each of these points is a different remote wildlife camera. The kind of in the middle is sort of like Tempe, ASU, Phoenix sort of area, to give some context. And so we found, thank you. So we found a variety of wildlife using our cameras. Some things that, I didn't necessarily expect, like North American river otters and feral domestic horses are not necessarily the first thing you think about when you think about Phoenix, but those are there. And so this water is definitely supporting a lot of interesting wildlife. Also things that you would classically expect, right? Bobcats, black-tailed jackrabbits, coyotes, mountain lion, lots of raccoons, gray foxes, collared peccary. We detected 3 of the 4 skunk species in Arizona, and then lots of different birds, roadrunners, different dove species, different raptors, etc. Thank you. So, and what we did with these cameras, right, is I ran a bunch of occupancy models, which basically helps us connect different environmental covariates to identify habitat relationships with different species. As a note, these are very preliminary results and are subject to change. But in terms of these coyote prey relationships, looked at human presence, vegetative cover, and urbanization, and each of them kind of differentially influenced coyotes and the prey species that they ate. So for example, with coyotes, found that in general, where there were more people detected, the frequency of coyotes tended to be less, but that was really just in the spring season, not in the fall season. Cottontail rabbits were positively associated with vegetative cover, urbanization, and human presence. Black-tailed jackrabbits were negatively associated with those sorts of things, and domestic cats were largely positively correlated with people and human variables. And also preliminary results from coyote scat analysis suggest that domestic cats and cottontail rabbits are significantly preyed upon by coyotes. But what's interesting, right, is that I just talked very briefly about some of those relationships, but you would expect that coyote relationships would be the same, their habitat relationships would be the same with what they're eating, right? That they would overlap, but we didn't necessarily see that to be the case. So coyotes are eating things that they don't necessarily have the same sorts of positive environmental associations with as the prey species that they ate, which could have important management implications and restoration implications. So kind of future applications, right? So different species have different needs. So then how do we manage across the board, right? How do we manage across broad contexts? If we want to maintain black-tailed jackrabbits, but they are found where there isn't vegetation, but we also want to maintain cottontails and they're found where there is vegetation, how do you deal with those kind of competing needs? And then in addition, right, if we're focusing on restoration and we restore these recreational areas and facilitate human presence, how will that influence wildlife and their interactions with prey, and then subsequently with people? And then from the water perspective, so Ashley looked at a bunch of different data relating to water quality within the same region. And so, for example, this map indicates percent wetlands in riparian zones, and you can see that kind of in the middle and southern extents, of the river. The darker areas indicate higher amounts of percent wetlands in these riparian zones, but you can see that it's kind of differentially distributed, which for me, from a wildlife perspective, right, can have different kinds of implications for animals, also for restoration capacity, etc. If you go to the next slide, thank you. So the left here shows sites of wastewater discharge that are regulated by the EPA. So it's sites of wastewater discharge from commercial and industrial companies, and you can see that those are pretty highly distributed throughout the valley and along these kind of waterways. And then the right shows the wastewater pollution index from the EPA, and darker regions indicate higher pollution. So once again, there's, if we're thinking about from a restoration perspective and an ecological perspective, there seems to be kind of a high degree of pollution as well. If we can go to the next slide. So here, this is a water subquality index. So it's a preliminary healthy watersheds EPA assessment. Darker regions are where the watershed has worst health, and health is defined as the total number of water quality standard violations combined with the total number of types of violations. And it's also just interesting, once again, speaking from a wildlife perspective, since that's kind of my lens, in some of these darker regions is anecdotally where we found more coyotes with mange. So it's possible that there's some interrelationships between water quality and wildlife health, which could then also influence people, especially if we're having restoration efforts that increase recreation, and then there's increased possibilities for these kinds of human wildlife interactions. So it's all connected. So yes, thank you.
And I was just going to say that I think Ashley, who's Kate's partner on that work, is just starting her PhD, and I think she's going to carry some of that water data on going forward to make some sort of like water quality map. And then for the future group, I worked with Vanya Bish. We're both sustainability scientists broadly, but we're thinking about now like going back to the actual like planning governance of this project. How can we affirm like all of this, like the diversity of frames and place-based context along the river, and how that might affect action going forward. So back to like the green transformation question, I think that this Real Reimagine project, there's two main hope, or I feel that there's like the main hopes for transformation through this project are establishing some sort of collaborative governance and coordination across the Salt and Gila watersheds. And then also speaking to Jorge's piece, the reconnection to place and water has huge justice implications also in the valley. So any sort of flow restoration is like important in unsettling that dominant narrative. But right now in the project, there's a gap, I think, of community-led co-production and leadership, because there is a lot of action going on at more like local scales along the rivers at different reaches. But right now in the partnership, the Real Reimagine partnership, it's mostly public actors, like those that are featured over here, and each in the jurisdictions along the river, each like municipality or territory or government maintains its own jurisdiction along the river. So there's this like collaboration that needs to happen, but there's not really governance support, I think, like in the actual Real Reimagine initiative to support that, and to support community involvement or involvement of CBOs. It's mostly public actors. So we feel that there's an opportunity right now in the early stages of the framing of this project, since framing is so important for urban planning projects and for the stories that we tell about the future and about place. We think that there's an opportunity to amplify community-led place-based framing of the Real Reimagine project, which just means understanding how place-based river narratives and frames are informing the action that is happening right now along the river, and how that's informed by future visions and solutions. And then at this regional scale, how do those place-based frames kind of interact to the point where some sort of like regional coordination can kind of emerge, or regional vision and pathway emerge. So we're interested in that local scale, and then and how that the relation between local scale scales up to the regional scale. So we're looking at what are the dominant narratives in different subcatchments in the Salt River Gila corridor, which currently the project itself is kind of like has a east zone, a central zone, and a west zone that represent various partners like geospatially along the river. And then how are place-based narratives linked to communities' proposed visions and pathways? And then at the regional scale, like the scale of the Real Reimagine project, where are solutions and pathways shared, and then where are barriers or spaces where coordination could help bring about transformative change towards community vision. So again, thinking about like, what does transformation mean at these smaller scales of influence? And then what does transformation of the Salt Gila River corridor then mean largely? So we are in the process of building connections through a couple different groups that we work with, again, like trying to leverage some of the relationships that we have at ASU and the power that that kind of means to try to bring in more community partners who are like actively working in change initiatives along the river. And so we're talking about potentially doing some visioning workshops with the CAP LTER, which is the long-term ecological research here. And we're also conducting semi-structured interviews with community leaders. And then in these interviews and workshops, we're doing mental model elicitation to kind of distill some of these place-based river narratives and visions, and then regional visions. And this is proposed work at this point. And then we'll do narrative analysis on those mental models and collaborative network analysis to see where like the pathways and solutions are shared along the watershed, and what are some of the pathways forward. And yes, that's all. I don't know if we have a concluding statement, but we didn't finish that slide.
All right, so first, thanks to both the teams for your nice presentations. And I just wanted to, we don't have as much time as I thought. So I want to ask one question of you guys, of anybody who participated in one of these summer team science experiences. And then maybe we can open it up and see if there are any specific questions for either one of the teams after that. But the question I wanted to ask is, the two groups took really different approaches to team science. I think that in the case of the Ecuador Duran team, you did a lot of decision making together about what you were going to do, and really put a lot of effort into sort of doing this as a team. And then one of the very first things that the ITSE team did in the Salt River was the Rio Salado was to break into 3 groups. And so let me ask first, Carlos, is anybody else, Margot, anybody else from that team, hearing the other one, how do you feel about the way you approach the sort of team science idea?
Okay, yeah, I can start off, but if anybody else who's here wants to jump in, feel free. I feel like we really focused on, like, especially because we were such an interdisciplinary group. We had like a geographer, a landscape architect, like I study environmental science, and then like sustainable development. And then our last person who's not here, Shruti, she studies international relations. We really needed to like find kind of a common ground where all of our skill sets, because they were so diverse, could come together. So we really found that common ground in the fact that we all wanted to kind of incorporate really resident perspectives. We all kind of like felt the same way about being American students with like this certain like power positionality coming into like a developing sector, like a developing neighborhood. And so we really wanted to kind of make sure that our project really focused on uplifting like resident perspectives. So that was a really big way that we were able to like kind of all come together as a team, because in some sense, all of our studies kind of incorporated social science in a way. And then when things kind of got a little bit more technical, like when we were kind of trying to understand like mapping flooding and exactly how flooding occurs, where it occurs, we really found that like some people in our groups, like more technical research really helped supplement that. And then additionally, I think that like the Spanish barrier also really helped us with working as a team. Like we had all kind of different ranges of like understanding and knowing Spanish. So we all kind of had to apply our skills in different contexts, like for like conducting 30 to 40 interviews in Spanish wasn't the easiest thing for us to do. So we really kind of had no choice but to like put all of our brains together and all of our skills together to come up with this project. And I think that we really, I don't know, I'm really proud of the way that we incorporated like all of our interests and all of our separate skills to like make something super interdisciplinary and that like kind of covered a broad scope of issues and topics.
Super. Margot or Addison, do you want to comment? Either one of you, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I can. I was just going to drop it in the chat, but I also think that the context of like the international experience and then our various like academic statuses, right? Not necessarily being as committed, not like as a bad thing, not a negative connotation, just like temporally committed to a longer research experience. I think kind of narrowed our individual capacities for doing like really deep research. And so I think that also kind of informed like, let's like rally the troops and like, let's go in on this together and really try and come up with a beautiful project.
So how about the other team? What are your reflections on that question about team science as an experience? Jorge?
Yeah, well, I think that for us, it makes sense to break us into teams because we were interested in different stuff, I guess. One of the things for me that was difficult was like, we didn't, since no one of us were indigenous or Akimelodam or, you know, so I thought that the first step for me to get into like researching this land and the place was to make a reflection of what was going on in this land. And that was something that, yeah, it was my own personal interest, I guess. And then I found someone who had a similar vision. But at the end, I think that all of us are working in different stuff. And at the end, we want this to inform, like, I think that what we're doing in the past informs the future, for example. But definitely, I think that we needed more communication among teams.
That's great. Well, you did meet frequently as a team, that all 6 of you. So it's not like you went off in your own corners or anything like that. But it was a different kind of approach, and I think both of them obviously worked and have some interesting pieces.
I was just gonna say really quick, because I think like, because I also have being previously in the Rula Iris experience as well. I think like it's also different when like I think Addison, Margot, or I forget. Okay, as you were saying, when like going to an international experience, or everyone having like a similar baseline where you're experiencing the place at the same time, the same way. I think it's different, like for all of us that are from Arizona and we already have our connections here, or like we have different relationships to people and to folks that we work with and stuff. And so it changes our framing of how we're gonna go about like the leverage points that we see.
Sure. I would also point out for those that are listening to this and these great presentations, that we have the Rula Iris that the first team presented on the Guayaquil is we're gearing up to open up applications for next summer, which will be in Bogota, Colombia. So if you have interest in doing some team science associated with, in this case, again, informal settlements, but in Bogota, look for that. It's NATURA sponsored. Everything will be on the NATURA website. All right. Yeah, the one, I know, I agree. I think it's great. I think we're at the hour, so I would love to have more discussion and particularly to have you guys talk to each other, but you know, we can connect you if you're interested in following up on anything. I want to thank both teams for these great presentations, and hopefully we'll do it again. Yeah, look for the Rula Iris new experience in Bogota coming up soon on the NATURA website. Thanks, everybody.